reading. If you want to be following along with me today, and I'll be looking at the Bible a couple of times, you can just get your Bible set, and you can find Bibles in the pews if you're new here at Faith. You can just put your bulletin in John's Gospel, and just to make it even simpler, put it at the end of John's Gospel, page 992, and we'll get to that in a bit. So we are, for 3 weeks, we are looking at a sermon series called A Restless Welcome. And this is week 2. So we have this week and next week to talk about it. Just kind of getting ourselves prepared for the fall when all of our programming starts up, when we're most likely to have visitors. We just get ourselves ready to exercise welcome. And so last week we talked about the empty spaces in our church where people are welcome, where Jesus is saving space. And our job is to be restless in filling those empty spaces that God has set aside for specific people. This week, I'm going to talk about who those people are that these empty spaces are saved for, and how we are to be in relationship with them. What is our job? And I'm going to do that 2 ways. First, we're going to talk about the Gospel of John. Last week we talked about Mark's whole gospel. This week we're going to talk about John's whole gospel. And then I'm also going to talk about the experience of meeting my in-laws. Sounds super fun, I know. So let's get at it. So I want to start part 1 concerning in-laws. First, I just want to get into your head those first conversations that you had with a serious, significant other about your family. Before you were married, and it was just starting to get serious, those conversations you would have, kind of preparing them for the people in your family they were going to meet, right? So those conversations about your parents and what they do for a living, and then your grandparents and where they came from, and then aunts and uncles and your favorite cousins and what everybody does for work and those sorts of things. Just giving each other an idea of your family and how your significant other might fit into that. Just want to prime your mind, because that's also what John's gospel is like. John's gospel is getting to know his family, his community. He writes very specifically about people. Last week when we talked about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we talked about how similar those 3 gospels are and how they pretty much look the same. And John's gospel is this totally weird thing. He's out there doing all kinds of different stuff. And mostly he's looking at Jesus differently. Matthew, Mark, and Luke just look at what Jesus did in his life, very biographical. But John is looking at what Jesus means for his community. So where Matthew, Mark, and Luke have parables that talk about Jesus' kingdom, John doesn't have any of those. He just talks about people and relationships. And part of that is because of John's relationship to Jesus. And that's this first part in John's gospel to look at. So if you look at page 922, John alone is named as the writer of his gospel. Only John. So if you look at chapter 21, verses 20 through 24, you'll see who's writing John's gospel. And I'll read. John and the beloved disciple. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" And Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." So the rumors spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So you see, the writer of this gospel, the one who put together everything in here, he has a very special relationship with Jesus. And that relationship informs John. And it's why his gospel focuses on relationships, specifically 6 relationships that are unique to John's gospel. 6 people who Jesus encounters, and they're only found in his gospel. Those 6 relationships tell us something about who belongs in the empty spaces here at Faith. And they also tell us how we are to be in relationship with them. But back to my in-laws. Okay, so this is my first set of in-laws. Those of you who are new here, I am divorced and remarried, and my first set of in-laws I met when I was 19 years old. And so we're having those initial conversations about what our families look like, and my future husband is telling me about his mother, who's a pastor, only woman I had met up to that point who's a pastor. And then he's telling me about his dad, who's a chief master sergeant in the Air Force. I knew that was a big deal. His aunt's a doctor. His uncle's the town fire chief. All wonderful, awesome things that should have made me excited to meet them. But I, at that age, was just getting my life on the right track. I've shared up here before how I was just recovering from a very broken, messy life. Not things that would surprise you at that age, but alcohol and drugs, and I was a high school dropout, and I had a theft charge that I was still trying to get figured out. I had been a mess. Now, God absolutely grabbed me, said, stop it, and intervened, and got me back on the right track, but I was still struggling with coming to terms with that past. And I knew whenever you get together with adults at the age of 19, they're going to ask you stuff about your life. And so I was anxious as all get out to meet these people and try to explain what was happening. So I was nervous and scared and honestly just kind of ashamed of the answers I'd have. And I can imagine similar feelings of anxiety and shame happening in the 6 people that John includes in his gospel, because that is the common thread running through those 6 people that John decides to include. And you can see it for yourselves. And if you want to follow along, we're going to start at John 3. And I'm just going to skim through real quick and show you all 6 of those people unique to John. In John chapter 3, it's page 970. So if you get on page 970 and follow with me, you'll see what I'm talking about. So the very first character that John introduces that is unique to John is Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is a Pharisee that is too ashamed to face Jesus. And how do we know? Because in verse 2 it says he came to Jesus by night. Something is going on with Nicodemus. He's ashamed. And so he only faces Jesus at nighttime. Then you don't have to turn the page, but go to chapter 4. The next person that John adds, Jesus and the woman of Samaria. But look at verses 17 and 18. This is a woman, Jesus says, who's at the well, and she's got some issues. And Jesus says to her, go call your husband and come back. And the woman answered him, I have no husband. And Jesus says to her, you are right to say that you have no husband, for you have 5 husbands. And the one you have now is not your husband. She is so ashamed. She can't even say out loud what's going on, and Jesus has to say it for her. All right, turn the page, chapter 5. The next unique character that John puts in there. He heals a man on the Sabbath. And look at verse 5. This is a guy who had been at the pool, the healing pool, who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And then the man has to admit, "Yeah, I want to be made well, but I don't have it in me to get up and go to the well." So Jesus has to deal with that fear and doubt and shame. In chapter 8, turn the page, 2 pages, chapter 8. The fourth character that Jesus adds, or John adds rather, a woman caught in adultery. Don't need to say anything about that. Shame all over. We'll read more. Chapter 9, the next page. Fifth man. A man born blind receives sight. In verse 2, all they can ask his disciples are, "Rabbi, who sinned that this man or his parents that he was born blind?" That's all anybody cares about. Who did it? This guy was born into shame. And then finally, next page, chapter 11. The sixth person that John adds, Lazarus. A man whose life is so short and sad that all we really know is he spent it begging outside the city gates. And his shame is so complete that he's wrapped up in death inside of a tomb. Do you see the theme of the people that John includes in his Gospels? It is a little depressing if you keep going on, right? It's a little sad. And this shame just keeps kind of running this current through John's Gospel. But more than that, if we were to really dig down deep and read these stories, what we will see is the theme also is every single one of these people is surrounded by churchgoers, synagogue people, Pharisees, and leaders in the church who keep them on the edge, who keep saying to them, "You've got to get yourself fixed and cleaned up before you can come in here." Every single story. It's not just about these people. It's about the relationship the people in John's church have with them. That common thread is that the people sitting in the pews think it's their job to fix those 6 people. That's what's happening in John's Gospel. So, my future husband is telling me all about his family. And he finally gets around to Uncle Alan. And he kind of takes a deep breath and he's like, "Uncle Alan is different. He put my grandparents through a lot, and he's been through a lot." And he tells me all about Alan's struggle with alcohol and his multiple failed marriages. He's the only one in the family who's got divorced, and he's got a couple of them. Tells me about his legal issues and about the kids he didn't take care of. And then he goes, "You know what, though? In these last, 10 years or so, he's doing a lot better. He's got a good job. He's remarried to a really great lady. He's taking care of his kids." And I said, "Well, what changed?" And he told me that Alan had an accident. He was drunk on the job at his factory that he worked at, and he accidentally stuck his right hand in a trash compactor, right? And the doctors were able to save a thumb and a few fingers, but they weren't able to make it look very nice, and it was just this mangled mess. But it did sober him up and get him back on the right track. That is what the Pharisees saw as their job in John's Gospel. They were there to sober these people up. They were there to be the machine that mauls their hand and gets them right so that they can participate in their church. And we see this most clearly in the story of the adulterous woman. So I'm going to read that to you. And if you want to look and follow along, it's John 8, 1 through 11. But here's what I want us to pay attention to. We not only see the adulterous woman, but this is right here in the center of these people. This is John saying, not only is this what this woman's supposed to do, but this is for you, my brothers and sisters in the pews, and what you are supposed to do. All right, page 977 if you're following. Then each of them went home while Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." Is there no one left to condemn you? Neither do I then. I have this fervent hope that those synagogue leaders are actually going to open up the doors to the church to let this woman in finally. And that's where they're off to. And Jesus says it was never their job to fix this woman. Not only that, it was never even in their capacity to do it. And why? Because they are just as broken. That is why they're sitting there holding stones. That is the message of John's gospel to his community. Let Jesus do the fixing. You do the welcoming of these 6 people and the folks just like them. So, it is Thanksgiving. And we are driving finally to meet all of his family for the first time. And I'm sitting there in the car quietly trying to figure out in my head how I'm going to answer questions about my messy life. And we get there. And the handshaking starts, and I'm putting faces to names. You're the chief master sergeant, you're the pastor, you're the doctor, you're the fire chief. And then I come to Alan. And I remember about his hand. And I don't want to stick out my own hand so that he doesn't have to put out his and shake it, because I don't want him to be embarrassed, so I just kind of put my hands down at my sides. But he reaches out with this absolutely mangled hand and grabs mine and shakes it. And all I can tell you to describe this moment was it was just complete vulnerability and a willingness to put his brokenness into my hands without shame. And it disarmed me, heart and soul, from my own shame. And he says to me, "If anyone's mean to you, just come find me." And I knew I was welcome, and I knew I wasn't alone. And 15 years later, when divorce was barreling down, it was Alan who called and said, "You will always be family." That is the message of John's gospel. He does not hide the stories of these broken people. He does not conveniently forget to share. He calls out their brokenness, and not only theirs, but he calls out the brokenness of those sitting in the pews, not to shame them, but to welcome them, to be vulnerable themselves, to be honest about their sin and brokenness. And he is saying the same thing to us, because the truth is, the mess that you may want to hide may be just the mess someone needs to see to know that they are not alone. These empty spaces here at Faith are not for people we need to fix, right? But for the people who need to be healed and fed and loved and forgiven and saved right along with us. Mutually assured salvation. Our job is to be vulnerable and open about our need for Jesus' saving grace. To say to the searching and seeking who come in here, welcome to faith. I am a hot mess, but Jesus is working on it. So if you are new and you are wondering, is this the place for you? The answer is yes, especially if you are a mess like the rest of us. And when we put our mangled hand into yours, when we share the hurt and the heartache and the disease and the sin and the joy and the good things that we have going on, when we put our hearts out there, you'll know just as we do that Jesus has brought you in here to scrape off the shame, to clean you up as best he can, until he sees you again next week. That is our work, folks. Let's get about it. Amen.